When my father didn't show up at my mother's funeral, I thought I'd reached the limit of heartbreak. His only explanation came in a one-word text: busy, later. I saw the pictures of him smiling in Paris with his mistress. That night, I drove 3 hours to his lake house. Not because I was still grieving, it was because I was done pretending. My name is Mara Donovan, and at 38, I thought I had a fairly comprehensive understanding of pain. I had navigated the corporate world, weathered friendships that broke apart like ships in a storm, and held my mother's hand as the light in her eyes faded to a soft, resigned flicker in a sterile hospital room. I believed I had a grasp on the lexicon of loss, but standing at the lectern of the small, stone-faced church in Cedar Hill, I realized I knew nothing. The first pew on the groom's side, my father's side, was empty. It wasn't just a vacant space, it was a chasm, a gaping wound in the fabric of the day. It was a meticulously polished, dark oak testament to his absence, screaming louder than any of the hymns we had sung. The seat was reserved for him, Richard Donovan, the grieving husband. But Richard Donovan was not here. Rain, a miserable, persistent drizzle, wept against the stained glass windows, blurring the apostles into watercolor specters. The sound was a dreary, constant drumbeat against the silence in my own heart. I gripped the edges of the wooden lectern, my knuckles white, the printed words of my eulogy swimming before my eyes. My voice, when I began to speak, was a stranger's thin, reedy, and threatening to shatter with every syllable. My mother, Eleanor Donovan, loved the rain. I began, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. She'd hated it. It made her joints ache. But you say things like that at funerals. You paint prettier pictures. She said it was the world's way of washing itself clean, of starting anew. I could feel the eyes on me, 200 pairs of them. Friends of the family, business associates of my father, neighbors who brought casseroles and offered condolences with pitying, practiced smiles. I could feel their collective gaze flicker from me to the empty seat and back again. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with the delicious, morbid curiosity of a small-town scandal. Where is he? Where is Richard? Their thoughts were as loud as the patter of the rain. They were waiting for him, expecting a dramatic, last-minute entrance, a grief-stricken husband, delayed by the sheer weight of his sorrow, rushing in to say his final goodbye. But the heavy oak doors at the back of the church remained stubbornly, resolutely shut. No one was coming. I spoke of my mother's kindness, her quiet strength, her passion for gardening, the way she could make anyone feel like the most important person in the room. Each word felt hollow, a flimsy bandage on a mortal wound. The woman I was describing felt like a character in a book, not the flesh-and-blood mother whose absence was a physical ache in my chest. My throat closed, a knot of unshed tears tightening with every memory I shared. I looked up from my paper, my eyes scanning the crowd, and landed on my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister. She gave me a small, encouraging nod, but her eyes were filled with a sorrow that went beyond the casket at the front of the church. It was an older, more complicated grief. When the service concluded, a funereal quiet settled over the attendees as they filed out, their hushed words and soft sobs echoing in the cavernous space. Aunt Carol made her way to me through the dispersing crowd, her sensible heels clicking softly on the stone floor. She bypassed the customary hug, instead placing a firm, warm hand on my shoulder, grounding me. Her touch was an anchor in the swirling vortex of my numbness. "He's in Europe, honey," she said, her voice low, meant for me alone. Her gaze didn't waver. With the word hung in the air between us, as cold and heavy as a block of ice. Clara Reese, the new director of PR at Donovan Holdings, young, ambitious, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. The woman my father had been seeing for, as I now understood, a very long time. A sound escaped my lips. It wasn't a sob or a gasp. It was a laugh, a brittle, horrifyingly out-of-place shard of sound that was sharp enough to cut. It was the laugh of a person who has just been pushed past the breaking point and into a strange new territory of calm, chilling clarity. "Of course he is," I said, my voice eerily steady. The numbness was solidifying, hardening into something else, something cold and strong. It wasn't a surprise. Not really. Not in the way a sudden car crash is a surprise. It was more like watching a storm gather on the horizon for years, seeing the clouds darken, feeling the pressure drop, and knowing, with a deep and certain dread, that it was going to hit. You just never knew exactly when or how devastating the impact would be. My mother had known. I was sure of it now. I remembered the last few years, her silences growing longer, a sadness taking root behind her eyes that no amount of forced cheerfulness could hide. She had stopped asking where he was on his business trips. She had simply absorbed the truth, carrying the weight of his betrayal with a quiet, heartbreaking dignity. Her tragedy wasn't just that he had cheated on her, it was that she had died before she could decide whether to forgive him or to finally leave. He had stolen that choice from her, too. After everyone had gone, after the last car had pulled away from the church, leaving tire tracks on the wet asphalt, I remained. The funeral director, a kind man with weary eyes, told me to take all the time I needed. I walked back to the front of the sanctuary, the scent of lilies and rain-soaked earth hanging heavy in the air. I sat in the empty front pew, my father's empty seat, and looked at the closed casket, polished cherry wood, gleaming under the muted light. It was so final, so quiet. Propped on a stand nearby was a large, framed photograph from their wedding day, almost 40 years ago. They were so young, my father, handsome and confident in his tuxedo, a man who looked like he owned the world, and my mother, radiant, her smile so genuine it hurt to look at. They were looking at each other with an expression of pure, unadulterated adoration, a lie. The entire foundation of my life, that photograph, was a lie. His smile was a mask, his adoration a performance. He was building a brand, and she was his first, most valuable asset. My phone, tucked away in the pocket of my black dress, vibrated against my leg. The sudden intrusion was jarring in the profound silence of the empty church. I pulled it out, my fingers clumsy. The screen lit up with his name, Dad. For a single, stupid, infinitesimal second, a flicker of hope ignited in the desolate landscape of my heart. Maybe he had an explanation, a terrible, tragic, but understandable reason, an accident, a sudden illness, anything but the truth. I swiped the screen to open the message. One word, busy, that was it. Below it, a follow-up message appeared a moment later, an afterthought of casual cruelty. We'll call later. Busy. He was busy. Too busy to bury the woman he had sworn to love and cherish for 40 years. Too busy to comfort his only daughter. Too busy to even fabricate a decent lie. The word hammered into my consciousness, dismantling the last vestiges of my grief and replacing it with something white-hot and terrifyingly pure. Rage. I didn't text back. I didn't call. I simply stared at the screen, at that one obscene word, until the letters blurred. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, I pressed the power button on the side of the phone and held it down until the screen went black. The silence that followed was different. It was absolute. It was the sound of a door being slammed shut, locked, and bolted forever. I made a silent vow, a promise to the woman in the casket and to the shattered girl I used to be. I would make him free. I would clear his schedule, permanently, at that moment, standing in the cold, silent church with the rain still whispering against the glass. I thought my course was set. I thought the plan forming in the back of my mind was about retribution. I had no idea that the real story, the one that would change everything, was only just beginning to unfold. The night was young, and my father's empty seat at the funeral was only the first of many voids he was about to experience. I grew up in a house that had everything except honesty. Our home in the suburbs of Dallas was a sprawling testament to my father's success. a colonial-style mansion with manicured lawns, a three-car garage, and interiors that looked like they'd been lifted from the pages of an architectural magazine. We had Italian marble in the foyer, original art on the walls, and a state-of-the-art kitchen my mother rarely used for anything more complicated than brewing coffee. We had wealth, we had status, we had the carefully curated image of the perfect American family. What we didn't have was truth. The silence in that house was more profound than any argument, a thick, suffocating blanket of things unsaid. My father, Richard Donovan, the architect of this elaborate facade, had a mantra he repeated so often it became the unofficial family creed. The family is the first brand. Mara, he'd say, adjusting his tie in the hall mirror before a gala or a charity dinner. And the Donovan brand stands for integrity, strength, and success. We project that at all times. It wasn't advice. It was a directive. Our lives weren't to be lived, but to be performed. Every smile, every public appearance, every holiday card was a calculated move in a long-term public relations campaign. We weren't a family. We were a holding company of 3, and he was the CEO. My mother was the master of her role. Eleanor Donovan was the epitome of grace and quiet support, always impeccably dressed, her smile a gentle, constant presence by his side. She was the perfect corporate wife, hosting flawless dinner parties for his business partners and volunteering for the right charities. She played her part so well that, for a long time, I believed it was who she really was. I see now that her poise was a suit of armor, her silence a shield. She absorbed his casual cruelties, his long absences, and his thinly veiled lies, and presented a calm, unblemished surface to the world. She suffered quietly, elegantly, ensuring the Donovan brand remained untarnished by the messy reality of her marriage. When I chose to study economics in college, she was my staunchest supporter. "You have a brilliant mind for numbers, Mara," she'd told me, her eyes shining with genuine pride. "You can do anything you want." My father, on the other hand, saw my education through the lens of his brand. "Excellent," he declared over dinner one night, swirling his wine, a solid foundation. "When you graduate, you can come work for the company. We'll put you in public relations. It's crucial to have someone in that role who understands the family, who understands the brand from the inside." He didn't see a daughter with her own ambitions. He saw a future asset, another tool for image management. He wanted me to become the official storyteller of the family lie. I don't know exactly when my mother discovered the full extent of his infidelity. It was a gradual erosion, I think, not a sudden collapse. A credit card bill he forgot to hide, a late-night phone call he took in another room, the scent of a strange perfume on his suit jacket. But I know that when the suspicion solidified into certainty, her first instinct was to protect the performance. "Don't let our daughter know," was the message she somehow conveyed, a silent plea in the face of her own devastation. She chose to shield me from the ugliness, believing, I suppose, that my ignorance was a form of protection. But the truth, like water, always finds a way to seep through the cracks. I was 25. Home from my first job in Chicago for the holidays. I was helping my mother with the laundry, a mundane domestic task. My father's suit jacket was draped over a chair. As I picked it up to take to the dry cleaners, a folded piece of paper fell from the inside pocket, a receipt. My eyes scanned it without thinking. It was from a boutique hotel in the city, the kind of place with more atmosphere than rooms. It was for a 2-night stay, charged to his corporate card. But the detail that made the air leave my lungs was the name on the guest reservation. It wasn't his. It was a woman's, Clara Reese, and beneath it, a room service charge for 2 bottles of champagne and a late-night dinner. I stood there in the laundry room, the scent of bleach and fabric softener in the air, the receipt trembling in my hand. The cold, hard reality of it was undeniable. For 13 years, I held that knowledge like a shard of glass in my gut. I watched him. I saw the patterns, the late nights at the office that coincided with business trips for his new PR director. I saw the way he treated my mother, with a distracted, placating affection that was an insult to her intelligence. The disparity in his generosity was the most galling part. I remember one Christmas, a few years after I found the receipt. He presented my mother with her gift in front of the whole extended family. It was a beautifully wrapped box containing a set of expensive scented candles. To help you relax. Eleanor, he'd said with a magnanimous smile, you deserve it. Later that day, while looking for a pen in his study, I found the receipt for a diamond tennis bracelet from Tiffany's, purchased just 2 days earlier. It wasn't for her. He bought diamonds for his mistress and gave his wife scented wax. The transaction was so cold, so emblematic of his contempt. My mother was a household expense to be managed, while Clara was an investment in his own pleasure for 10 years. I said nothing. I swallowed the truth, choked it down every time we sat together at a holiday dinner. Every time he lectured me about loyalty and integrity, I stayed silent for my mother. I saw the fragile peace she had brokered with herself, the life she had chosen to endure, and I couldn't bring myself to be the one to detonate it. Telling her I knew would have forced a confrontation she wasn't ready for, a choice she wasn't prepared to make. So I became a co-conspirator in the pretense. I smiled at the family gatherings, made polite conversation, and perfected the role of the devoted daughter, all while the lie festered inside me, curdling my love for him into something cold and hard. But now, everything has changed. My mother is gone. The pact of silence died with her. Seeing the photos of him online, shared by one of Clara's oblivious friends, was the final desecration of my mother's memory. There he was, in Paris, the city he had always promised to take my mother back to. He was raising a glass of wine, a broad, carefree smile on his face, with Clara Reese nestled beside him, her hand possessively on his arm. The photo was time-stamped. It was taken while I was at the funeral home, picking out my mother's casket. While I was drowning in grief, he was celebrating. The silence is no longer a shield for my mother. It's a shroud over the truth. It's an injustice. The family that pretended so well for so long is about to have its carefully constructed brand dismantled, piece by piece. I want the truth to come out, not in whispers or rumors, but like a floodlight, harsh and unforgiving, illuminating every lie, every betrayal. I want him to see the real legacy he's built, one of deceit and profound disrespect. And as I sit here, in the deafening quiet of my mother's empty house, the rain a distant memory and the rage a cold, steady flame in my chest, I know exactly where to begin my search for the kindling. The 3-hour drive to the lake house was a silent, numbing pilgrimage. The rain from the funeral had finally relented, leaving behind slick, black asphalt that reflected the cold, distant stars. My hands were steady on the wheel, my gaze fixed on the hypnotic ribbon of highway unfolding before me. I drove not in a haze of grief, but with a chilling, crystalline focus. The lake house wasn't a place of comfort. It was an archive of lies. It was the stage my father had used for his grand performances of contrition, the place he'd brought my mother for reconciliatory weekends after his transgressions had become too obvious to ignore. He called it their sanctuary. I now understood it was his trophy room, a testament to his ability to manage his deceptions. Turning off the main road, I followed the winding private lane that cut through a dense forest of pines. The air grew colder, smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. Then, the trees cleared, and the house came into view. It was a starkly modern structure of glass, steel, and dark cedar, perched on the edge of Lake Travis. It was designed to look like it was floating on the water, a masterpiece of architectural arrogance. Tonight, it looked like a tomb. A single dim light glowed from a downstairs window, a lonely beacon in the oppressive darkness. He wasn't back from Paris yet. I knew that. But someone was here. I parked the car and walked to the front door, my heels making no sound on the damp flagstone path. I didn't need a key. I still had mine from years ago. A relic from a time when I believed this place was a symbol of our family's resilience. The lock turned with a well-oiled click, and I stepped inside. The air was still and cool. carrying the faint, familiar scent of cedar and my mother's favorite lavender potpourri. A woman emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. It was Sophia, the housekeeper who had been with my parents for over a decade. She was a quiet, kind woman with worried eyes, and she had always been more my mother's confidant than my father's employee. Her face, when she saw me, was a mixture of shock and a strange, somber relief. "Miss Mara," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I am so sorry about your mother. She was a wonderful woman. Thank you." "Sophia," I said, my own voice sounding flat and distant to my ears. "I know you cared for her." She nodded, her eyes welling with tears. She glanced nervously toward the darkened hallway, as if expecting my father to materialize from the shadows. "He is not here." "I know." Sophia hesitated for a moment, wringing the apron in her hands. Then, a look of resolve settled on her face. "Your mother?" she began, her voice dropping even lower. "She told me something, a few weeks ago. She said, if anything happened to her, I was to give you something. She said to wait until you came here alone." My heart, which I thought had turned to stone, gave a painful throb. Sophia disappeared into the back of the house, into the master suite my parents had shared. I heard the soft scrape of a drawer opening. She returned carrying a simple wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, made of dark, polished cherry wood. She held it out to me with both hands, as if it were a sacred offering. She kept it hidden, in the back of her closet. Sophia explained, her eyes fixed on the box. She told me, "If anything happens, give this to Mara. She will know what to do." I took the box. It was heavier than I expected. My fingers traced the smooth, cool wood. This was it. This was the part of her she couldn't show the world, the truth she had been quietly assembling in the dark. "Thank you." "Sophia," I said again, "you've done the right thing." She gave me a watery smile and retreated back to the kitchen, leaving me alone in the vast, silent living room. I carried the box to the large oak table that overlooked the lake through a wall of floor-to-ceiling glass. I sat down and, with a deep, steadying breath, I lifted the lid. The first thing I saw was a photo album, its leather cover worn and soft. I opened it. It was filled with pictures of them at this house. My mother, laughing as my father pretended to push her off the dock. The two of them, bundled in sweaters, drinking coffee on the deck as the autumn leaves turned brilliant shades of red and gold around them. It was a carefully curated history of their happiness, and every image was a dagger. Beneath the album, the contents became less sentimental. There was a stack of papers, held together with a binder clip. They were bank statements and wire transfer receipts. My eyes scanned the details. A series of large payments, tens of thousands of dollars each, made from a subsidiary account of Donovan Holdings to a private consulting firm I'd never heard of. I pulled out my phone, my fingers flying across the screen as I searched the firm's name. The registration documents came up instantly. The sole proprietor was listed as Clara M. Reese. They weren't just bonuses. This was a systematic siphoning of company funds, disguised as legitimate business expenses. Deeper in the box, I found a thick manila envelope. My hands felt cold as I opened it and slid out the contents. It was a copy of the original incorporation documents for Donovan Holdings, dated 35 years ago. I read through the legalese, my eyes searching for the list of founding partners, and there it was. Richard Donovan, 60% shareholder, and Eleanor Vance Donovan, 40% shareholder. My mother wasn't just the supportive wife. She was a founder. Her inheritance, a significant sum from my grandfather, had been the seed capital that had launched the entire enterprise. She had owned almost half of the company he so proudly called his own. Beneath that document was another, more recent one, a share transfer agreement, dated just 6 months ago. My breath caught in my throat. I read the clauses, my economics degree making the dense language horrifyingly clear. It was a legal transfer of her entire 40% stake in the company to him, for the symbolic sum of $1. My eyes jumped to the reason cited for the transfer: Due to the signatory's declining health and acknowledged inability to fulfill her fiduciary duties to the company, they had used her illness against her. They had declared her unfit and coerced her into signing away her legacy. I looked at the signature line. It was hers, but it was frail. A shaky, spiderweb version of her once confident script. He hadn't just cheated on her. He had disarmed and dismantled her, piece by piece, until nothing was left. The final items in the box were a collection of photographs, not in an album, but loose, printed on glossy paper. They were surveillance photos. My father and Clara, not in Paris, not on vacation, but at work. A shot of them through his office window, their heads close together over a document, his hand resting on the small of her back. Another of them at a conference in Chicago, sharing a private laugh at the hotel bar. A third of them leaving a high-end restaurant late at night, getting into the same car. My mother hadn't just known about the affair. She had been documenting it, gathering evidence of a conspiracy that ran far deeper than simple infidelity. This wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a corporate one. Clara wasn't just the other woman. She was his accomplice. At the very bottom of the box, lying on the velvet lining, was a single business card. Jonathan Mills, Esca, Forensic Accounting Corporate Litigation. Tucked beneath it was a small, folded note, written in my mother's hand. He has everything, the originals, the reports. He was waiting for my signal. He said we had a case. She wasn't giving up. She wasn't fading away quietly. My quiet, graceful, long-suffering mother had been preparing for war. She had hired a shark, and she had been sharpening her teeth, ready to fight for her life's work. But she had run out of time. I closed the box and walked to the wall of glass, looking out at the lake. The water was a sheet of black ink, reflecting nothing. A cold wind whipped across the surface, rattling the windows in their frames. The grief and rage I had felt earlier now coalesced into something new, something hard and purposeful. It was a duty, a legacy. Mom, I thought, my hand pressed against the cold glass. I'll finish this for you. I turned away from the window. My path suddenly, terrifyingly clear. I sat back down at the table, pushed the box aside, and opened my laptop. The screen cast a cool blue light on my face. The plan began to form in my mind, not as a chaotic storm of emotion, but as a series of calm, logical, and devastating steps. This would not be revenge. Revenge was hot and messy. This would be a judgment. It would be a verdict, delivered with the cold, impartial weight of the truth she had left for me in a simple wooden box. The next morning, I walked into the lobby of Donovan Holdings. The building was a monument to my father's ambition, a soaring tower of smoked glass and polished steel that scraped the Dallas sky. The air inside was chilled and smelled of money and industrial-strength air freshener. People in sharp suits moved with brisk, self-important strides across the gleaming marble floor, their conversations a low, professional hum. I, in my simple black dress from the funeral, was a specter at the feast, a stark reminder of a reality they were all paid to ignore. Heads turned, whispers followed in my wake like a trail of static. I was the CEO's grieving daughter, a tragic figure to be pitied from a safe distance. They had no idea I was not there to mourn. I was there to collect. I didn't go to my father's office on the top floor. I went directly to the executive wing on the 34th, where the public relations department was housed. I didn't have to ask for directions. I knew exactly where I was going. Her office, the one with the corner view, had once been my mother's. Before she got sick, my mother had used it as a base for her charity work, a quiet space within her husband's empire. Now, it belonged to the woman who had replaced her in every way. I walked past a sea of cubicles, the clicking of keyboards faltering as people recognized me. I ignored their stunned, curious faces and stopped in front of the frosted glass door with the nameplate that read Clara Reese, Director of Public Relations. I didn't knock. I simply opened the door and stepped inside. She was on the phone, her back to me, looking out at the panoramic view of the city. She was laughing, a light, musical sound that made my skin crawl. No, it was fabulous. She was saying, Paris is always a good idea. She trailed off as she sensed my presence and turned. Her phone still pressed to her ear. The smile on her face didn't so much falter as it did recalibrate. It shifted from genuine amusement to a mask of practiced, professional sympathy in a fraction of a second. She was good. I had to give her that. She was dressed in a sharp, cream-colored pantsuit, her blonde hair styled in an impeccable bob. She looked every bit the powerful executive. She looked nothing like my mother. "I'll have to call you back," she said into the phone, her eyes never leaving mine. She hung up and placed the phone gently on her large glass desk. She rose from her chair and walked toward me, her expression a careful study of compassionate concern. "Mara," she said, her voice soft and pitched with just the right amount of sorrow. "I am so sorry for your loss. Your mother was a wonderful woman. We were all devastated to hear the news." She reached out as if to touch my arm. I took a half step back, just enough to make the gesture awkward. The air between us crackled. I let the silence hang for a beat, watching the mask of sympathy flicker as a sliver of uncertainty crept into her eyes. "You will be," I said. My voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it landed in the silent, temperature-controlled office with the force of a gunshot. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows drew together in confusion. I beg your pardon. You will be sorry," I repeated, my gaze as cold and hard as the steel frame of the building. For my loss, I didn't wait for her to process it. I turned and walked out, leaving her standing in the middle of her stolen office, the professional mask finally shattered, replaced by a look of dawning comprehension and fear. My next stop was the 40th floor, the legal department. I bypassed the receptionist and walked directly to the office of the head counsel, a man named George Wexler who had been with my father since the beginning. He was a portly man in his late 60s with a perpetually worried expression. When his assistant announced me, his worry lines deepened into canyons. "Mara," he said, rising from behind his massive desk, "this is a surprise. My deepest condolences. Of course, a terrible, terrible loss. Thank you." "George," I said, cutting through the pleasantries. I didn't sit in the chair he offered. I remained standing, placing my briefcase on his desk and clicking it open. "I need to see the company's charter, the original shareholder agreements, and the minutes from all board meetings for the past 12 months. George blinked, his jowls quivering slightly. "Mara, I don't understand. This is all highly confidential material. In your situation, I'm not sure it's appropriate." "My situation," I said, my voice level, "is that of a 40% founding shareholder in this company." I slid the copy of the original incorporation document across the desk to him. His eyes widened as he read the names. Then I slid the share transfer agreement next to it. An illegal transfer of shares was executed 6 months ago. Under duress, and based on fraudulent claims of my mother's capacity, until a court proves otherwise, her shares, as per the original will, my father has not yet updated, are held in trust. With me as the executor, I have every right to see those documents. In fact, I have a fiduciary duty to do so. He stared at the papers, then up at me. The pity was gone from his eyes, replaced by a dawning, panicked respect. He had seen me as the grieving daughter. He was now seeing me as a major legal problem. My father, in his arrogant haste to consolidate his power and jet off to Paris, had made a critical error. He hadn't yet filed my mother's updated will, the one she had no doubt been forced to sign, along with the share transfer which would have disinherited me. The original document, the one that named me executor of her estate, was still the legally binding one. "The original will hasn't been updated," George stammered, more to himself than to me. "You have rights. I'm aware." I said, "Now, about those documents." An hour later, I was installed in an empty office on the executive floor. Not Clara's office, but one just down the hall. A conference room, they called it. But it had a desk and a commanding view. It was my mother's real office, the one she'd had before Clara's arrival. They had stripped it of any personality, but I could still feel the ghost of her presence here. I sat in the large leather chair, the files and documents George had reluctantly provided stacked neatly in front of me. On the wall opposite the desk was a gallery of framed photographs, my father shaking hands with the governor, my father cutting a ribbon at a new factory, my father accepting an award, and there, in the center, was the newest addition, a large, glossy photo from the company's last annual leadership summit. It was my father and Clara Reese, standing side by side, smiling for the camera, the official team, the Donovan brand. I spent the next 2 hours poring over the documents, cross-referencing dates and figures with the wire transfers and contracts from my mother's box. The picture that emerged was uglier than I could have imagined. Inflated sponsorship deals for conferences where Clara was the keynote speaker. Consulting fees paid to her shell company for market analysis reports that were plagiarized from publicly available data. It was a systematic, brazen fraud, all signed off by my father. I found the one I was looking for, a multi-million-dollar sponsorship contract for a tech convention in Chicago, the one from the surveillance photo. The amount was absurdly high for the event's scale. I scanned the contract and the corresponding financial report into a single PDF file. Then, I attached the photograph from my mother's box, the one of my father and Clara at the hotel bar during that same convention, looking less like business colleagues and more like a couple on a romantic getaway. I opened a new browser, using a VPN to mask my location. I composed a new email from an encrypted, anonymous account. The recipient was a journalist at the Wall Street Journal, a man notorious for his ruthless takedowns of corporate corruption. The subject line was simple: a look inside Donovan Holdings. The body of the email contained only one sentence: follow the money. I attached the file and hit send. Then I closed my laptop, packed my briefcase, and walked out of the building, the whispers following me once again. I didn't have to wait long. The next afternoon, the headline broke online: Donovan Holdings under scrutiny for questionable executive expenses, potential shareholder fraud. The article was devastating. It didn't mention Clara by name, referring only to a high-level PR executive, but it laid out the inflated contract next to an analysis of typical industry spending. It didn't print the photo, but it heavily implied an inappropriately close relationship between the CEO and the executive that may have clouded his financial judgment. It was a masterpiece of journalistic implication. I watched the stock ticker on my laptop all day. The red arrow pointed down, a bleeding gash on the screen. It started as a trickle, then a slide, then a full-blown hemorrhage. By the time the market closed, Donovan Holdings had lost 17% of its value, billions of dollars, erased in a matter of hours. My phone rang just after 5 o'clock. The caller ID was a French number. I let it ring 3 times, then answered, my voice perfectly calm. Hello, Mara. What did you do? His voice was a low, furious growl, stretched thin with panic across the thousands of miles of ocean that separated us. I could hear the clatter of a busy restaurant in the background, the sounds of his Parisian holiday, now a chaotic backdrop to his imploding world. I paused, picturing him there, his face pale, his perfect evening ruined. I savored the moment, the beautiful, terrible transfer of power that was taking place through the tiny speaker of my phone. I'm not sure what you mean. Dad, I said, my voice as smooth as glass. Don't play games with me. The stock, the journal. This has your fingerprints all over it. I smiled, a slow, cold smile that no one could see. I stood up and walked to the window of my mother's house, looking out at the garden she had so lovingly tended. I'm just cleaning up the family brand, I said softly, using the words he had drilled into me my entire life. It was starting to look a little tarnished. There was a profound, suffocating silence in my mother's house after the stock market closed. It was the kind of quiet that follows a distant explosion, when the air itself seems to be holding its breath. I sat in her favorite armchair, the chintz fabric cool against my skin, and watched the evening light fade outside the window. The phone call, when it came, did not startle me. I had been waiting for it. It wasn't a ring, but the specific, digital chime of a video call, I picked up my phone from the side table. The screen displayed his name, glowing against the twilight gathering in the room. I let it chime 4 times before I answered. A small, petty act of control. His face materialized on my screen, a high-definition image of a man trying desperately to hold onto the reins of his crumbling world. He was in Paris, just as I knew he would be. The background was a caricature of fine dining crisp white tablecloths, gleaming silverware, the soft golden glow of intimate lighting. I could see the blurred figures of other patrons, hear the sophisticated murmur of French conversation and the clink of wine glasses. He had a half-eaten plate of something exquisitely prepared in front of him and a glass of deep red wine. He was trying to project an image of normalcy, of a man interrupted during his dinner, not a king watching his empire burn from across an ocean. The facade was almost perfect, but the tension in his jaw and the hard, cold fury in his eyes gave him away. "Mara," he began, his voice a low, controlled rumble that failed to conceal its frayed edges. "This is madness. You have to stop this. People are losing faith." He used the word people as if he were talking about a panicked, abstract mob. He meant investors, the board, the market. His entire world was built on the fragile scaffold of their belief in him, in the Donovan brand, and I had just kicked out the primary support. I held the phone steady, my expression unreadable. "You mean they're seeing the truth?" I replied, my voice calm and even. I did not raise it. I did not need to. The truth was a battering ram, and it was doing its work without any help from my emotions. His eyes narrowed. "The truth. You've leaked a confidential document and a private photograph to create a fiction. A scandal. You're feeding them lies. Was the contract a lie?" "Dad?" I asked softly. "Were the wire transfers to Clara's shell company a lie? Was the photo of you together in Chicago a lie?" He flinched at the mention of the city. He hadn't known the extent of what I had. At that moment, another face leaned into the frame, coming to his defense. It was Clara. She was wearing a black dress and a string of pearls, and her face was a tight mask of indignation. She placed a proprietary hand on his shoulder, positioning herself as his partner, his equal. It was a fatal miscalculation. "You're ruining your father's legacy," she hissed, her voice sharp and brittle. She was looking at me as if I were a petulant child throwing a tantrum, not a woman systematically dismantling her life. I shifted my gaze, looking directly into the phone's camera lens. I wasn't speaking to her. I was speaking to him. But I wanted her to hear every word. I wanted her to understand that she was a symptom of the disease, not the cause. He did that when he skipped my mom's funeral. I said. The words landed with the dead weight of an unanswerable fact. They sucked the air out of his Parisian fantasy. The clatter of the restaurant seemed to fade into the background. Clara's hand slipped from his shoulder. I saw the accusation in her eyes turn to something else, the realization that she was out of her depth. A player in a game whose rules she didn't understand. This wasn't about the company, not really. This was about a quiet church in Cedar Hill, and an empty seat in the front row. My father's composure finally cracked. He pushed his plate away. The scrape of porcelain on linen, a harsh, grating sound. The carefully constructed image of the powerful man at dinner was gone, replaced by the raw fury of a cornered animal. "What do you want?" he gnarled, the question tearing from his throat. It was the only language he truly understood. He thought this was a negotiation, a hostile takeover. He thought I wanted a bigger share, a seat on the board, a payout. He was reaching for his checkbook, the only tool he had ever used to solve a problem. He believed everything, and everyone, had a price. I let the question hang in the air for a long moment. I let him stew in his transactional worldview. Let him calculate the figures that might make me go away. The silence stretched, thin and taut, across the thousands of miles between us. I thought of my mother, alone in her final months, her world shrinking while his expanded. I thought of her quiet dignity, the strength she must have summoned to fight back in secret. "I want you to feel," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of my entire life. I want you to feel what she felt. I want you to sit in a room and wait for someone who is never coming back. I want you to understand the silence she lived in when you were busy building your new life. I want you to feel what it's like to be left behind. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. There was no comprehension in his eyes, only a blank, stunned confusion. I hadn't asked for money or power. I had asked for the one thing he was incapable of giving: empathy. I had demanded a piece of his soul, and he discovered, perhaps for the first time, that he had nothing there to give. He was silent for a full 5 seconds. I watched a universe of emotions flicker across his face: rage, denial, a brief, terrifying flash of something that might have been shame before he slammed it all down, and the mask of cold fury returned. He had no counteroffer. He had no move left to play. He did the only thing he could. He ended the call. The screen went black. I sat in the deepening darkness of my mother's living room, the silence of the house settling back around me. I felt no victory, only the grim, hollow satisfaction of a job that was far from finished. The first strike had landed. Now, he would be coming home. The next day, my phone pinged with a notification from the flight tracking app I had installed. A private jet, owned by a Donovan Holdings subsidiary, had just taken off from Le Bourget Airport in Paris. Its destination, Austin, Texas. He wasn't going to the corporate headquarters in Dallas. He wasn't going to the family home he had abandoned. He was retreating to his sanctuary, to the lake house. He was going to the scene of the crime to figure out how the evidence had been found. I knew, with absolute certainty, that he would be there tonight, and so would I. I went to my desk and picked up the small, black USB drive I had prepared. On it was everything, the entire contents of my mother's box, plus the corporate documents George Wexler had given me, the damning financial reports I had found, and the audio file of a voicemail my mother had saved his voice, cold and dismissive, telling her the share transfer was for the best and just a formality. It was a digital archive of his betrayal. I slipped the USB drive into my pocket. It felt small and insignificant, but it was a key, and it would unlock the final, brutal truth of his legacy. As I walked to my car, the setting sun painted the sky in angry streaks of orange and purple. The confrontation was coming. The real conversation was about to begin. I thought of the words I would use when I saw him. They formed in my mind, a quiet, cold promise. Let's talk legacy. Dad, the lake house was a void of darkness when I arrived. The towering pines surrounding it were black sentinels against a moonless sky, and the lake itself was an abyss, indistinguishable from the starless expanse above. He had turned off all the exterior lights, trying to make his sanctuary invisible, but he had left one light on inside. A single, small table lamp cast a weak, amber glow from the main living room, a solitary ember in a world of charcoal and ink. It was an invitation. I let myself in with my mother's key. The house was cavernously silent, the thick rugs and heavy furniture swallowing the sound of my entry. I followed the dim light, my footsteps unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. The air was stale, thick with the scent of old wood, cold ashes from the fireplace, and something else, the sharp, pungent aroma of whiskey. He was there, exactly as I had pictured him. He was sitting in a large leather armchair, his back to the wall of glass that overlooked the dark water. He was a silhouette framed by the lamp's glow, a tumbler of whiskey held loosely in his hand. He didn't seem surprised to see me. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, just stared into the amber liquid in his glass, as if it held the answers to the universe. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, stripped of his tailored suits and the sycophantic entourage that usually surrounded him. He was just a man, alone in a dark room, waiting for the end. I walked to the center of the room and stopped, the space between us charged with a decade of unspoken truths. The silence stretched, a taut wire of animosity. He finally lifted his head, and his eyes found mine in the dim light. They were bloodshot, etched with the fatigue of a transatlantic flight and the deeper exhaustion of a man who sees the walls closing in. "You've destroyed everything I built," he said. His voice was a raw, gravelly thing, shredded by anger and jet lag. It was not a question, but a verdict he had already passed on me. He, Richard Donovan, was the builder, the creator. I was the demolition crew. I said nothing. Instead, I walked to the large oak table where I had discovered my mother's secrets just 2 nights before. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, black USB drive. I placed it on the polished surface of the table. It made a soft, definitive click in the silent room. "No," I said, my voice as steady and cold as the lake water outside. "I'm showing what you really built." A harsh, bitter laugh escaped his lips. It was a terrible sound, devoid of humor, full of jagged edges. "You're your mother's daughter," he sneered, taking a deep swallow of his whiskey. He meant it as the ultimate insult. In his mind, my mother was weak, emotional, a liability he had to manage. "Yes," I said, meeting his gaze without flinching. I'm the part of her you always underestimated." His smile faltered. That was the one response he hadn't prepared for. He had expected tears, shouting, a messy, emotional confrontation he could dismiss and control. He was not prepared for this cold, surgical precision. I didn't wait for him to recover. I opened my briefcase, took out my laptop, and set it on the table next to the USB drive. I plugged the drive in and turned the screen toward him. The sudden blue-white light of the display illuminated the room, throwing our faces into stark relief, painting the shadows in the corners a deeper shade of black. "You and I both know that the board will demand an internal investigation," I said, my voice taking on the detached tone of a prosecutor. "Let's have a preview." I clicked open the first file. It was an email thread with a subject line that read, "Q3 projections." I enlarged it for him to see. An email from Clara to the chief financial officer, with my father copied, instructing him to recategorize several large consulting fees as marketing expenses to obscure the trail. "Richard wants this buried." One line read. I clicked to the next file, a side-by-side comparison. On the left, an invoice from the Chicago Tech Convention for their sponsorship fee of $250,000. On the right, the internal expense report signed by my father, claiming a sponsorship fee of $1.5 million, with the difference funneled to Clara's Shell Corporation. "That's a bold marketing strategy," I said, my voice dripping with ice. "Paying 6 times the asking price." I kept going, one file after another. I showed him the forged quarterly reports, the doctored attendance records from events they had sponsored, the chain of emails where Clara outlined how to inflate the company's public profile with fabricated data. It was a comprehensive, undeniable portfolio of their fraud. With every click, I was dismantling his reality. Brick by brick, he watched, his face growing progressively paler under the laptop's clinical glow. The arrogant defiance drained away, replaced by a slack-jawed horror. He wasn't looking at a daughter seeking revenge. He was looking at an airtight legal case that would not only destroy his company, but would very likely send him to prison. The evidence wasn't circumstantial. It was a confession, written in the precise, damning language of corporate malfeasance. When I finally got to the audio file of his voicemail to my mother, his face was the color of ash. I let his own voice fill the silent room cold, condescending, pressuring her to sign away her life's work. "It's for the best, Eleanor. Just a formality to protect the company's stability. We can't have your health becoming a liability." I closed the laptop. The sudden darkness was a mercy. "If this goes public," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "we'll lose the company." It was the first honest thing he had said all night. Not, "I'll go to jail," not, "I betrayed your mother," not, "I'm sorry," but, "We'll lose the company." It was, and always would be, his only real concern. The brand. "Then maybe it's time someone else runs it," I said quietly. That was it. That was the moment his last thread of control snapped. A guttural roar of pure, impotent rage erupted from his chest. He launched himself out of the chair. Not at me, but at the room, at the world, at his own reflection in the dark glass. With a violent sweep of his arm, he sent the whiskey tumbler flying. It arced through the air and shattered against the stone hearth of the fireplace. The explosion of glass was deafening in the silence. Amber liquid sprayed across the floor, the sharp, alcoholic scent instantly filling the air like a toxic cloud. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just watched him, heaving, his chest rising and falling, a defeated king in his empty throne room, surrounded by the wreckage of his own making. The confrontation was over. There was nothing left to say. Slowly, I stood up. I left the laptop on the table, closed, but still a silent, ominous presence. I left the USB drive next to it, a small black key to his destruction. As I turned to leave, I reached into my pocket one last time and pulled out a small, folded piece of notepaper. It was cream-colored, with my mother's monogram at the top. I unfolded it and placed it on the table, on top of the USB drive. He watched me, his breathing still ragged. His eyes darted down to the note. On it, in my mother's elegant, familiar script, were 4 simple words: "Truth always floats. Richard." I turned and walked out of the room, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. I didn't look back. I left him there alone, with the ghost of his wife, the evidence of his crimes, and the smell of spilled whiskey in the suffocating darkness. I didn't have to do anything. After leaving him in the ruins of the lake house, I simply drove home, went inside, and waited. The mechanism of his downfall, once set in motion, was now self-perpetuating. The choice I had left him on that table, the USB drive, and my mother's note, was no choice at all. He could either let me release the information and be utterly annihilated, or he could attempt a controlled demolition. He chose the latter, a desperate, foolish attempt to get ahead of the story. It was like trying to outrun an avalanche. The next morning, it began. My phone buzzed on the nightstand before the sun was fully up. It was a news alert from the Wall Street Journal. The headline was stark, professional, and utterly devastating. Donovan Holdings announces internal investigation amidst allegations of financial impropriety. Internal investigation, the classic corporate euphemism for a 5-alarm fire. It was a confession wrapped in the language of proactive governance. He had made the call, or the board had forced his hand. He had fed them a piece of the truth in the hopes of satisfying their hunger, but all it did was confirm the scent of blood in the water. I turned on the television. Every financial news network was leading with the story. On one channel, a panel of experts with grim faces dissected the press release. A move this drastic suggests the board has found something significant. One analyst said, adjusting his glasses, the market abhors uncertainty, and right now, Donovan Holdings is a black box of it. On another channel, a graphic showed the pre-market trading figures. The stock, already wounded, was in a nosedive. When the market opened at 9:30 a.m., the slide became a free fall. I watched the numbers on my laptop screen, a cascade of crimson, down 20%, down 25%. Employees were interviewed outside the Dallas headquarters, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion as they scurried past the throng of news vans and reporters. The brand my father had spent his life cultivating, the one built on a mythical foundation of strength and integrity, was becoming radioactive in real time. By noon, the stock had stabilized, if one could call it that, at a 30% loss, wiping out billions more in market capitalization. The company was hemorrhaging value, and the bleeding showed no signs of stopping. In the midst of the corporate chaos, there was a personal implosion happening in the background. Clara Reese had vanished. I checked her social media profiles that afternoon. Her Instagram, once a curated gallery of designer clothes, exclusive parties, and exotic travel funded by my mother's legacy, was gone. The page simply read, "Sorry, this page isn't available." Her LinkedIn profile, which had proudly listed her meteoric rise at Donovan Holdings, had been deleted. A reporter from a local Dallas station stood outside her luxury high-rise apartment building, reporting that she hadn't been seen all day and wasn't answering her door. She had evaporated, like a true PR professional. She knew an unsalvageable crisis when she saw one. She had cut her losses and run, leaving my father to face the inferno alone. Then, late in the afternoon, the story took a turn from a corporate scandal into a sordid, public spectacle. A video was leaked. It appeared first on a gossip blog, then was picked up by mainstream news outlets within the hour. The quality was terrible, clearly shot on a cell phone from a distance, likely by a junior employee in an adjoining office. The audio was muffled, but the words were horribly clear. It was my father and Clara, in his office, from a day or two before their Paris trip. They were arguing, their voices sharp and venomous. He was pacing, his face contorted in a mask of fury. Everything was perfect, he was shouting. His voice distorted, but his words unmistakable. He slammed his hand down on his desk, the sound a sharp crack that made the person filming flinch. You got greedy. You pushed too hard, too fast. Clara's response was inaudible, but her posture was defensive, her arms crossed. Then came the line that would be replayed on a loop for the next 24 hours. The pathetic, desperate cry of a guilty man trying to find a scapegoat. He pointed a finger at her, his whole body trembling with rage. You used me. The irony was so thick, it was almost suffocating. The great Richard Donovan, the master manipulator, the man who had used my mother as a stepping stone, as a brand asset, as a shield, was now painting himself as the victim of a conniving woman. The video was a death blow. It confirmed the affair the Journal had only hinted at, and it showcased a CEO who was not a pillar of strength, but a volatile, unstable man completely out of control. The authorities, who had likely been monitoring the situation already, now had the public pressure they needed to act. By evening, the Securities and Exchange Commission, in conjunction with the U.S. Attorney's Office, announced a formal investigation into Donovan Holdings for financial fraud and market manipulation. The internal investigation was over. A criminal one had begun. My phone rang just as the news broke. It was a blocked number. I knew it was him. This would be the last time. I answered and said nothing. Waiting. I heard his ragged breathing on the other end of the line. He sounded like a man who had been hollowed out, his voice a ghost of its former booming authority. You did this, he rasped. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a final, bewildered acknowledgement of my power. I looked out the window. A gentle, silent flurry had begun. The first snow of the season. Fat, white flakes were drifting down from a slate-gray sky, beginning to blanket the dead leaves in the yard. It was just like the night my mother had died. The world outside the hospital window had been muted by a sudden, silent snowfall, as if nature itself were laying a clean, white sheet over her suffering. No, I replied, my voice quiet but firm, carrying across the line with absolute finality. You started this. You started it 35 years ago when you used her money to build a company you called your own. You started it every time you lied to her. You started it when you sat in Paris while she was being buried. I just wrote the ending. He didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. There was a long, static-filled silence. The sound of a connection stretched across a chasm of irreparable damage. Then, I heard a soft click. He had hung up. I lowered the phone and continued to watch the snow fall. It was coming down harder now. A thick, peaceful curtain, muffling the sounds of the world, cleansing the air. The chaos of the day, the news alerts, the stock tickers, the shouting on the television, all of it faded away, replaced by the profound, gentle silence of the falling snow. My work was done. The brand was broken. The truth was out. The noise was finally over. A sense of quiet I hadn't felt in 13 years settled over me. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't happiness. It was a deep, resonant peace. I thought of my mother, of her silent strength, of the war she had been preparing to fight. I pressed my hand to the cold window pane, my breath fogging the glass. She's finally at peace, I whispered to the empty room, and in that moment, I realized I was too. A week passed. The storm of the public collapse had moved on, leaving a landscape of wreckage in its wake. The news cycle, with its insatiable and fleeting appetite, had found new corporate titans to fell, new scandals to dissect. Donovan Holdings was now old news, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms, its stock symbol a flat line on the ticker. The quiet that descended was profound. It was the silence of an empty battlefield after the cannons have ceased to roar. I spent the days in my mother's house, sorting through her belongings, moving through the rooms like a ghost. The purpose that had driven me with such ferocious intensity now fulfilled, leaving a strange and hollow vacuum in its place. Then, the phone rang. The caller ID showed a name I recognized from the bottom of my mother's box. Jonathan Mills. Esquire, Ms. Donovan. His voice was calm and professional, a soothing baritone that stood in stark contrast to the chaos of the preceding week. I've been following the news, my condolences on your loss, and my commendations on your resolve, Mr. Mills, I replied, my own voice quiet. My mother thought highly of you. The feeling was mutual. She was an exceptionally strong and intelligent woman, he said, which is why I'm calling. She left something with me, in my firm's trust, an envelope, with a very specific set of instructions. I was to deliver it to you personally, and only after the full truth of her situation regarding the company was made public. He paused. I believe that condition has now been met. We met the following afternoon in his downtown office. It was nothing like my father's world. There were no panoramic views or ostentatious displays of wealth, just walls of law books, the scent of old paper and leather, and an atmosphere of quiet, unshakable competence. He was a man in his 50s, with kind eyes and a firm handshake. He didn't pry or ask for details. He simply slid a thick, cream-colored envelope across his polished mahogany desk. My name was written on the front in my mother's elegant, familiar script. She wrote this about a month before she passed. He said gently, she was a remarkable woman. She knew she was running out of time, but she was determined to lay the groundwork for justice. I took the envelope. The paper felt warm, almost alive, in my hands. I thanked him and left, not wanting to open it under his compassionate but professional gaze. I drove home, the envelope sitting on the passenger seat beside me like a silent occupant. Back in the quiet of my mother's house, I sat at her small writing desk, the one that looked out over her garden, now dormant under a thin layer of melted snow. With trembling fingers, I broke the wax seal she had pressed onto the back. The letter inside was written on her personal stationery, the paper thick and expensive. Her handwriting was as I always remembered it, a graceful, flowing cursive, though I could see a slight tremor in some of the lines, a subtle record of her body's betrayal. I began to read. My dearest Mara, if you are reading this, my love, then it means the light has finally found the darkness. It also means you are the one who held the torch. I knew it would be you. I always knew your strength ran deeper than even you believed, and I know what it must have cost you. Which leads me to my first hope for you if you are reading this. It means you are finally strong enough to not have to hide your tears anymore. For years, I have watched you build walls around your heart to protect yourself from the quiet disappointments of this family. You learned my trick of pretending too well. You thought strength was the absence of pain. But it is not. Strength is feeling it all and continuing to stand. You have stood, my daughter. Now, please, give yourself permission to feel. The war is over. It is safe to grieve now. A single, hot tear escaped my eye and fell onto the paper, smudging the ink of her signature. For weeks, my grief had been fuel, transmuted into cold rage and strategic action. I had not allowed myself the simple, human luxury of weeping for my mother. Her words, a loving command from beyond the grave, broke the dam. I lowered my head to the desk and cried, a storm of silent, shuddering sobs for her, for the life she should have had, for the daughter who had to become a warrior instead of a mourner. After a long time, I lifted my head, my breath catching in my throat, and continued to read. My second hope is a much harder one. I know. I want you to try not to hate your father. Do not mistake this for a request to forgive him. Forgiveness is a gift, and he has not earned it. But hatred is a poison. It is a fire that consumes the vessel that holds it. I have spent years fighting the bitterness in my own heart, and I know its corrosive power. To hate him is to allow him to occupy a space in your soul forever. It is to let his darkness become your own. He is a man who has always been driven by his appetites for success, for adoration, for power, and in the end, he was consumed by them. Do not let yourself be consumed by the same fire, just from a different direction. You are better than he is. Do not let hate make you the same. I stared at the words, a fresh wave of conflict washing over me. Not hate him. Hatred had been my compass, my armor, but as I read her words, I understood. She wasn't asking me to absolve him. She was asking me to save myself. She was giving me an exit strategy, not for the war with him, but for the war within myself. He was a force of destruction. To hate him was to stay locked in his orbit of destruction forever. The only way to truly win was to walk away from the ashes, not to sift through them for the rest of my life. There was one last paragraph. So what do you do instead, my darling girl? You have already done it. You have done the one thing he could never tolerate. You have sought the truth. I leave you with this last thought. Always let the light speak for you. Darkness and deceit are his tools. They cannot survive in the open. You do not need to shout, or to hate, or to destroy. You only need to open the curtains and let the sun pour in. It will do the work for you. The truth is, its own advocate. Yours forever, Mom. I folded the letter carefully along its original creases. My tears were dry now, replaced by a sense of profound, aching clarity. I walked into the living room and stood before the fireplace, where their wedding photograph still sat on the mantelpiece, the smiling, hopeful young couple in the silver frame, a fiction, a brand. I took my mother's letter and placed it on the mantel, leaning it gently against the photograph, the final truth, resting against the first lie. I didn't cry anymore. A weak, watery smile touched my lips. That light she spoke of. I had found the switch. I had flooded the dark corners of their lives with it, and just as she'd predicted, the shadows had scattered. My next action felt like the only logical conclusion. It was the fulfillment of her last wish. I scanned the letter and composed an email to the same journalist at the Wall Street Journal. My attached quote was simple, a distillation of everything I now understood. My mother was preparing to fight for her company and her name before she died. She left me this letter. I believe it speaks for itself. Truth isn't revenge, it's justice. The story that followed was an inferno. It was republished everywhere, from the front page of the New York Times to viral threads on social media. The narrative shifted instantly. This was no longer just a story of corporate fraud. It was a human tragedy. The story of a dignified, brave woman who had been systematically erased by a narcissistic husband. My mother, Eleanor Donovan, was no longer a footnote in her husband's story. In the end, she became the hero of her own. The public and professional pressure on my father became unbearable. The remaining board members, their own reputations now on the line, demanded his immediate departure. 2 days after my mother's letter was published, Donovan Holdings issued a terse, one-sentence press release. The board of directors has accepted the resignation of Richard Donovan as CEO and chairman, effective immediately. I read the news on my phone while sitting in my mother's garden. There was no surge of triumph, no satisfying punch of victory. I didn't feel giddy or powerful. The world simply felt quiet. The noise that had filled my head for so long had finally stopped. The war was over. The brand was dead. The truth was out. And all that was left was the heavy, peaceful, and profound silence of a battle won, and a mother finally, truly, at rest. 1 month later, I walked through the glass doors of Donovan Holdings for what I knew would be the last time. The atmosphere in the lobby was funereal. The usual confident hum of commerce had been replaced by a tense, anxious quiet. Employees moved with their heads down, avoiding eye contact, the shockwaves of the public collapse still radiating through every floor of the building. My father's name, once a symbol of power and success, was now a stain they were all trying to scrub away. They were a company adrift, a ship without a captain, taking on water fast. The emergency board meeting was being held in the main conference room on the 42nd floor. It was a sterile, intimidating space I had been in only a handful of times as a child. A room designed to make people feel small. A massive, polished mahogany table dominated the center, surrounded by a dozen high-backed leather chairs. The men already seated around it looked like prisoners on death row. They were the company's remaining board members, a collection of my father's oldest and most powerful associates, men who had profited from his success and were now terrified of being dragged down with him into the abyss. When I entered, all conversation ceased. A dozen pairs of eyes, belonging to men I had known my entire life as uncles, fixed on me. There was no pity in their gazes now, only a mixture of fear, resentment, and a grudging, wary respect. I was no longer Mara, the CEO's daughter. I was Ms. Donovan, the unpredictable variable, the holder of a 40% stake that made me the single largest shareholder in their beleaguered company. I was the arbiter of their fate. I wore a simple, dark gray suit, my hair pulled back severely. In my hand, I carried a single leather portfolio. I took the empty seat at the head of the table, the one that had always been my father's. The symbolism was not lost on them. The interim chairman, a man named Arthur Vance, who had been my father's right hand for 30 years, cleared his throat. He looked haggard, the stress of the past month having carved new lines into his face. "Mara, Ms. Donovan," he began, his voice strained. "Thank you for coming. As you know, the company is at a critical juncture. We are exploring all options to ensure stability and restore shareholder confidence." It was a weak, pathetic understatement. The company was on life support, and they were looking at me to either pull the plug or authorize a miracle transplant. He gestured vaguely at the papers in front of him. "We are prepared to discuss your role moving forward, a permanent seat on the board. Of course, perhaps an executive position, whatever you feel is appropriate compensation for the damages incurred." He was trying to bargain, to appeal to the same greed that had driven my father. He thought I was here to claim my piece of the broken kingdom. "What do you want, Ms. Donovan?" Arthur finally asked, the question blunt and stripped of all pretense. It was the question that hung over the room like a guillotine. "What is your price?" I let the question linger in the suffocating silence. I looked at each of them in turn. These men who had sat by silently for years, who had enabled my father's behavior, who had toasted his success while my mother was being systematically erased. I opened my portfolio and slid a single document onto the table. It was the legal confirmation of my control over my mother's 40% share of the company. "What I want," I said, my voice low and clear, carrying to every corner of the silent room, "is a company that doesn't betray its founder." A few of them shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. They thought I was referring to my father. "I'm not talking about Richard Donovan," I clarified, my voice turning to ice. "I'm talking about Eleanor Donovan, the woman whose inheritance was the seed capital for this entire enterprise, the woman who owned 40% of this company from its inception, the woman whose name you have all allowed to be forgotten." Arthur Vance paled. Eleanor's contribution was, of course, foundational. No one is denying that. Then you will all understand that the current state of this company is an insult to her memory. I continued, my gaze unwavering. "Its brand is toxic. Its leadership is a disgrace. Its very name is synonymous with deceit. It cannot be salvaged. It must be reborn." I leaned forward slightly, my hands flat on the table. "I am not here to join you. I am here to extricate myself and my mother's legacy from this wreckage. I have a proposal." I slid a second document across the table toward Arthur. It was a term sheet. "I am willing to sell my entire 40% stake." I announced. The men around the table visibly relaxed. A sale, a clean exit. They could survive this. "I have already been in negotiations with a buyer who is prepared to acquire my shares and make a tender offer for a controlling interest in the company. They have the capital to stabilize the stock and the vision to rebuild. Arthur picked up the term sheet, his hands trembling slightly. A buyer who the Athena Capital Group. I said. A murmur went through the room. Athena Capital was a well-known, highly respected private equity fund. They were also famous for one other thing: their entire leadership team, from the CEO down, was comprised of women. They specialized in investing in and promoting female-led businesses. The brutal poetic justice of the move settled over the room, stunning them into silence. I wasn't just selling my shares. I was orchestrating a complete ideological takeover. I was replacing my father's corrupt patriarchal empire with a matriarchy. They are prepared to move immediately, I said, but my offer is contingent on one non-negotiable condition. I paused, making sure I had every bit of their terrified attention. Richard Donovan is to be severed from this company in every conceivable way. He will retain no shares. He will hold no honorary title, no chairman emeritus status, no consulting contract. His name will be removed from any and all company materials. He will not be permitted to set foot in this building again. You will erase him. In exchange, I will give you a future. That is my offer. It was an execution, delivered in the calm, rational language of a business deal. They looked at each other, their faces a mixture of horror and profound relief. I was offering them a lifeline, a way to save themselves and their fortunes. The price was the complete and utter annihilation of their friend and former leader's legacy. It wasn't a difficult choice for them to make. We agree, Arthur said, his voice a hoarse whisper. It was almost immediate. Loyalty, I had learned, was just another commodity to be bought and sold. I stood up. My work here finished. My lawyers will be in touch to finalize the details. I turned and walked toward the door, leaving them to the quiet, clinical task of dissecting the carcass of my father's career. As I stepped out into the hallway, I almost ran into him. He was standing there, just a few feet away, leaning against the wall. He must have been waiting the entire time, a ghost haunting the halls of his fallen kingdom. He looked terrible. He had lost weight, and his expensive suit seemed to hang off his frame. His face was gray and sunken, the confident, predatory arrogance in his eyes replaced by a dull, hollow emptiness. He straightened up as he saw me, a flicker of his old pride momentarily surfacing. He looked at my face, searching for something triumph. Hatred. Tears. He found nothing. My expression was a blank slate. He was the one who looked defeated. He looked down at the plush carpeting, unable to meet my eyes. "You won," he said, his voice a dry, rasping sound, the ghost of its former power. I stopped and looked at him, not at the shell of the man before me, but at the memory of the father he had once pretended to be. I felt nothing, no pity, no anger, no satisfaction, just a vast, quiet emptiness, the space where my love for him used to be. "No," I said, my voice soft, but clear and steady in the silent hallway. "Mom did." He flinched, as if I had struck him. He had no response to that. It was the one truth he could no longer deny. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a final, silent admission of the fact. Then, he turned and began to walk away from me, down the long, empty corridor. His shoulders slumped, a solitary figure disappearing into the shadows of the empire he had built and lost. I did not watch him go. I turned in the opposite direction and walked toward the elevators, my gaze fixed forward, not looking back. That night, I drove back to the lake. It was a pilgrimage in reverse, a return to the place where the war had truly begun. Not to fight, but to sign the treaty of peace within myself. The 3-hour drive was not filled with the cold, simmering rage of my previous journey. It was a quiet, meditative passage through the darkness, the headlights of my car cutting a lonely path through the sleeping Texas hill country. The world felt muffled, hushed, as if it were holding its breath in anticipation of this final act. I parked not by the house, but further down the road, by a small, secluded cove I remembered from my childhood. I walked through the whispering pines, the soft carpet of needles silencing my footsteps. When I emerged from the trees, the lake spread out before me, a vast, unbroken sheet of polished obsidian. The moon was a sliver, and the sky was a deep, star-dusted indigo, so clear and profound that the water held its perfect reflection. There was no wind. The surface was so still, it was impossible to tell where the lake ended and the sky began. The world was holding a mirror up to itself, and in the middle of it all was a perfect, profound silence. Across the water, on the far shore, the house stood in darkness. My father's house. It was no longer a trophy room or a sanctuary of lies. It was just a structure of wood and glass, a silent, hulking shape against the trees. A single light burned in a downstairs window, the same weak, amber glow as the night of our confrontation. It looked small and terribly lonely from this distance, a faint, flickering pulse in a body that was shutting down. I knelt at the water's edge, the damp, cool earth seeping through the fabric of my jeans. From my bag, I took out two things, a simple white votive candle, and my mother's letter, still folded in its cream-colored envelope. I placed the candle on a flat, smooth stone at the water's line and struck a match. The small flame sputtered to life, a single, defiant point of light in the vast darkness, its warmth a living presence against my cold fingers. I lit the candle's wick. The flame grew, steady and bright, its reflection dancing on the still surface of the water. Then, I took my mother's letter. This was her last will and testament. Not the legal document of shares and assets, but the testament of her spirit. It was her final word, her truth, her light. This was not an act of revenge, and this was not a memorial. It was a release, with infinite care. I placed the letter on the surface of the water, a few inches from the shore. The thick, quality paper was buoyant, and it floated perfectly, a small white vessel on a black, star-strewn sea. Then, I gently pushed the candle, still on its stone, onto the center of the envelope. It was a tiny makeshift boat, a funeral pyre for a life of lies, carrying the last flicker of a quiet, indomitable flame. A current, so subtle it was almost imperceptible, caught it. The letter began to drift, slowly, serenely, away from the shore and out toward the center of the lake. It moved with a grace and purpose that felt preordained, the candle flame a tiny, unwavering star guiding its passage. It was a beacon of truth, floating on an abyss of secrets, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I watched it go, my arms wrapped around my knees, my breath misting in the cold night air. I watched until it was a distant, golden spark in the immense darkness, and as I watched, my gaze drifted past it, to the far shore, to the single, lonely light in the house across the water. Then, something happened. The light flickered once, twice, and went out. The house was plunged into complete and utter darkness. It was a slow, deliberate surrender. It was as if he had been watching my small, silent ceremony from his window, and upon seeing the light of her truth finally drift free, he had acknowledged his own final defeat. He had extinguished his last light and accepted the darkness. He had erased himself from the landscape. The finality of it washed over me, a wave of such profound peace that it was almost overwhelming. It was done, all of it, the fighting, the anger, the strategy, the pain. It had all been laid to rest. I leaned my head back, looking up at the infinite, silent stars, and I felt my mother's presence not as a memory or a ghost, but as a part of the quiet, expansive peace of the night itself. I whispered the words into the stillness, my voice a small, fragile thing in the vast cathedral of the night. "We're done, Mom." As if in response, a gentle breeze, the first of the night, stirred from across the lake. It was soft and cool, and it carried with it the clean, sharp scent of pine, the damp smell of the earth, and the faint, ghostly aroma of wood smoke from a distant, dying fire. It was a sigh. It was an exhalation. It was the world, finally breathing again. I stood up, my joints stiff from the cold. I brushed the dirt from my knees and turned my back on the water. I did not look to see if the small flame was still burning. I did not need to. Its work was done. I walked back toward the trees, my footsteps sure and steady on the dark earth. There was no need for any more apologies. There would be no tearful reconciliations, no deathbed confessions. There was no need for a different ending. This was the only ending there could ever have been. It wasn't a victory, and it wasn't a tragedy. It was simply, finally, the truth. Each footstep was a punctuation mark at the end of a long and painful sentence, and with each one, I felt the weight of the past 13 years falling away from my shoulders. I was walking away not just from the lake, but from the brand, from the lies, from the ghost of the father I never really had. I was walking toward the rest of my life, a life that would be my own. That night, the house finally slept, and so did I. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'm so curious to know where you're all tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening. It's amazing to connect with you all. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a thumbs up. And to help even more people find this story, please support it by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world.